President Biden welcomed Kevin McCarthy to the White House Wednesday for their first one-on-one meeting since McCarthy became House Speaker. The topic was the debt ceiling, which the U.S. hit about 2 weeks ago. The Treasury Department says the U.S. will default in June if Congress can't raise the limit. Republicans want budget cuts in order to do that. The great mystery remains what exactly those cuts would entail, something McCarthy would not share publicly.
I don't think we'll come to an agreement if I negotiate with you. I think the respectful way to do it is to talk to the president as we did right now for more than an hour. We both walked away. We have different perspectives, but we both laid out some of our vision of where we'd want to get to.
It may be some time before we find out what is on the table, but we know probably what isn't. Most of our spending is determined by law, including entitlements like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The part that can change, known as discretionary spending, makes up just 30% of the budget. But just because that part of the budget can be cut doesn't mean it will be. The largest chunk of the discretionary budget is national defense. Many Republicans don't want to make any cuts there. Only 55% of the discretionary budget, that smaller portion, is really available for cutting, but it contains health, veterans, education, and transportation programs in that part of the budget, and those are very popular. But what about foreign aid? Well, that's just 3.7%. Abolish the IRS? Less than 1%. To actually make an impact on the deficit, cuts would have to come in programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which are 50% of the entire budget. Those programs are extremely popular. Few politicians will ever consider touching them. Former President George W. Bush tried to reduce Social Security costs by turning it into a private system, and his party abandoned him. This means that despite grand claims of tackling the budget imbalance, the political reality is that Republicans in Congress are not likely to take the political risks that would be required to match their rhetoric. David Wessel joins me now. He's the director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy at the Brookings Institution. David, first, you can rebut anything I said there, but if the Republicans wanted to bring the budget into balance, what would that look like in this budget environment?
Well, to bring the federal budget into balance over the next decade without raising taxes, which is what the Republicans say they want to do, would require cutting $14.6 trillion out of the budget over the next decade. And that would mean cutting spending, if you cut everything, about 25%. If you took defense, Social Security, and Medicare off the table, it would mean cutting everything else by 50%. That's not going to happen. I think what happened today was actually a favorable sign, though. The president and Speaker McCarthy have been throwing verbal bombs at each other for weeks now. They came out of this meeting, the president's people said it was frank and straightforward discussion. Speaker McCarthy said he's hoping to reach an agreement on budget before the debt ceiling really binds. And that would seem to me to be an opportunity for the White House to get what it wants, to separate the debt ceiling from some kind of budget agreement.
So, David, give us a sense of the economic impact of the budget deficit and the debt in terms of the current economic picture we're in right now, because the argument from Republicans is this profligate spending over both parties when both parties have been in charge has an economic impact. What's your assessment of that impact in the short and long term?
Well, I think most economists think that the size of our response to the COVID pandemic, both at the end of the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration, was too big. And that's partly responsible for the inflation we have today, partly. But that spending is largely done. So what's important is to look to the future. And I don't think anybody expects really sharp budget cuts that would take effect right away. What we're talking about is there a way to reduce the projected spending and raise taxes over the period of time so we can begin to stabilize the debt? I think it's important to recognize that sometimes the Republicans talk about spending as if it's all waste, fraud, and abuse and stuff that people don't want. But as you point out, a lot of the spending is Social Security and Medicare, which people do want, and the Republicans are shying away from that. President Trump himself has said, former President Trump says, don't touch that. And secondly, a lot of what's been passed recently, investments in tunnels and broadband and electric vehicle subsidies, are pretty popular and will pay off in the future. So I think the right answer is an abrupt cut in federal spending or an abrupt increase in taxes would slow the economy at a time when the Federal Reserve is trying to slow the economy. Over time, we need to reduce spending. We need to raise taxes to stabilize the debt. But that'll happen over a period of years if we ever get agreement in Congress to do that.
And that's where the rub is. As I know you covered many of these different commissions and agreements and efforts to try to tackle these issues in the past. And politics has only gotten thornier since then. It would require an act of political bipartisanship that we haven't seen.
Correct. And it doesn't seem likely to happen. And one reason it isn't happen is that I don't sense some big public angst about the federal deficit. Despite all the rhetoric from Washington about the debt's too big and everything, I don't sense that voters are saying this is not their top of their list. And secondly, the economic urgency to do this is not obvious. In the past, it's been when the Fed is raising interest rates and the Fed has said, we are raising interest rates because government spending is out of control and deficits are too big. But the Fed is raising interest rates now to fight inflation. They seem to be pretty much done with that campaign. So it's not, and long-term interest rates in the bond market, which are really important, are still pretty low. So there's not a lot of pressure from the markets to do anything about the deficit. So if people aren't demanding it, and the markets aren't scaring politicians, and the political system is polarized, I think what we can expect is a lot of rhetoric and not much action.
And I don't want to let you go, David, without asking you about the Fed's action today. Expected, but what's your assessment of the ongoing campaign by the Fed and where it stands relative to its benchmarks of not tipping the U.S. economy into a recession?
So I think the good news is that the Fed, it looks better today than it did a couple months ago, that the Fed can reach its goal of bringing inflation down without tipping the economy into a recession. But Fed Chair Jay Powell made clear that the Fed is going to keep raising interest rates. He said at one point a couple more times. And I think that his view, and he pretty much expressed this, is that I would rather do too much to fight inflation, raise interest rates too much, than to do too little. And if he sticks to that, I think it's likely we'll have a pretty slow economy in the year and a half ahead. And recession remains a strong possibility, but not a certainty.
All right, David Wessel, we're always very grateful when you're with us. Thank you.
You're welcome.